The Japanese gave it a nickname, not a tactical designation, not a military code, a name, the way you name something you cannot escape. They called it B-san. Mr. B, it was a form of dark, grudging respect, the kind of people reserve for a force of nature they have no answer to. And by the time the war was over, they had every reason to feel that way. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was unlike anything that had ever flown. It was the most technologically advanced bomber of the Second World War, bigger, faster, and more complex than any aircraft its crews or its enemies had ever encountered. It flew at altitudes where most Japanese fighters couldn't reach it. It carried bomb loads that dwarfed its predecessors. It crossed ocean distances that made the Pacific, once Japan's protective moat, a highway for American destruction. And the program that built it cost more than the Manhattan Project, more than the effort to invent the atomic bomb itself. The B-29 program ran to approximately $3 billion, roughly 50% more than the $2 billion spent on America's nuclear weapons development. It was, by any measure, the single most expensive military undertaking of the entire war. And yet the United States pressed forward because American planners understood something that Japan's high command refused to believe until it was too late: that the B-29 wasn't just a bomber. It was the instrument by which the war in the Pacific would be decided. To understand why Japan feared it, you have to understand what it was capable of, and what it took to make it work. Design work on the Superfortress began in earnest in 1940. Boeing's engineers were asked to produce what the Army Air Corps called a very long-range superbomber, a machine that could carry heavy bomb loads across thousands of miles of open ocean, fly above enemy anti-aircraft fire, and survive anything Japan could throw at it. The specifications were, by the standards of the day, almost fantastical. The result was an aircraft that incorporated technologies no production bomber had ever used before. The B-29 was the first operational bomber with a fully pressurized crew cabin. At the altitudes it was designed to fly, above 30, seers in feet. Unpressurized aircraft forced their crews to breathe through oxygen masks, wear electrically heated suits against temperatures that could fall to 60 below zero, and work under conditions that degraded their judgment and physical capability. The B-29's pressurized fuselage changed all of that. Its crews flew in relative comfort, connected between the forward and rear compartments by a pressurized tunnel running above the bomb bays. That tunnel became one of the plane's most distinctive features, and a passage airmen crawled through, 50 feet above the Pacific, while the world outside the aluminum skin was thin and deadly cold. The fire control system was equally revolutionary. Previous heavy bombers relied on individual gunners manually aiming their own weapons, each one isolated at his own station. The B-29 used a centralized analog computer system, 5 gun sights, 5 targeting computers, 4 remote-controlled turrets, that allowed a single gunner, or even the fire control officer, to assume command of multiple turrets at once and redirect fire across the aircraft's defensive zones in seconds. It was an integrated weapons network decades ahead of anything its enemies possessed. The B-29 didn't just outrange Japan's fighters, it outthought them. And then there was the range. The Superfortress could carry 6 tons of bombs more than 3,200 miles. That figure reshaped American strategy across the entire Pacific. When American planners were mapping the island-hopping campaign, the availability of the B-29 was a decisive factor in choosing to seize the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, rather than press through the more heavily fortified Carolines. From the Mariasas, B-29s could reach the Japanese home islands. The Pacific suddenly was not large enough to protect Japan. But getting the Superfortress to that point nearly killed the program. The Wright R-3350 engines that powered the B-29 were among the most powerful piston engines ever built, 2,200 horsepower each, 4 per aircraft. They were also, in their early form, dangerously unreliable. Overheating was chronic. Engine fires were not unusual. In February 1943, the second XB-29 prototype caught fire in the air above Seattle. The blaze spread to the wing. The aircraft came down on a meat-packing plant north of Boeing Field, killing the entire 10-man crew and 20 workers on the ground. The program's leaders absorbed that loss and pressed on, because they had no other choice. By early 1944, the situation had grown critical. B-29s were rolling off the production lines at Boeing's enormous Wichita plant, one of 4 factories manufacturing the aircraft across the country, but they were rolling off incomplete. Changes to the design were coming faster than the assembly lines could incorporate them. Hundreds of the aircraft sat on the Wichita flight apron in all weather, awaiting modifications they couldn't receive on the factory floor. Workers labored outdoors in the Kansas winter, in temperatures that forced them to stop every 20 minutes and warm themselves at gasoline heaters just to keep the work moving. General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, flew to Kansas personally to break the bottleneck. What followed became known simply as the Battle of Kansas, a furious, around-the-clock push to get 4 bombardment groups combat-ready. Engineers, mechanics, and factory workers threw themselves at the unfinished aircraft. The hour count to complete a single B-29 had started near 157,000 man-hours for the first production models. By the war's end, that number would be driven below 20,000. But in the winter of early 1944, the race felt like it might be lost. It wasn't. The first B-29 mission against Japan launched on June 15, 1944, targeting steel facilities at Iwata on Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's home islands. The results were modest. High-altitude precision bombing over Japan turned out to be far harder than planners had anticipated. The jet stream, winds of up to 200 miles per hour at altitude, shredded bomb patterns. Cloud cover over Japanese targets was persistent. The bombs fell, but they rarely fell where they were aimed. Japan's air defenses, meanwhile, struggled to answer even the imperfect B-29. The Superfortress flew too high for most Japanese anti-aircraft guns to reach it reliably. The fighters that could climb to intercept it found a machine bristling with remotely controlled guns guided by analog computers, and found, too, that the B-29 could absorb enormous punishment and keep flying. Japan threw its best interceptors at the Superfortress, and found that even when they reached it and hit it, the aircraft frequently flew home. The Japanese had almost nothing that could reliably stop it. The B-29 flew where it wished, but it wasn't destroying Japan fast enough. In January 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay took command of the XC-1 Bomber Command operating from the Marianas. LeMay was a driven, unsentimental man who looked at the high-altitude campaign's results and concluded they were unacceptable. Japan's industrial capacity was not being broken. 63% of Japanese war production was dispersed not in large, identifiable factories but in small workshops, 30 employees or fewer, embedded in the wooden residential districts of Japanese cities. High-altitude precision bombing could not touch them. LeMay made a decision that his own crews considered suicidal. He would send his B-29s in low, at 5,000 to 7,000 feet instead of 30,000. At night, without most of their defensive guns, loaded to maximum capacity with incendiary bombs. Stripping the guns saved weight. Flying lower at night, he calculated, would confuse Japan's searchlight and anti-aircraft systems, which were calibrated for high-altitude attack. And incendiaries against Japan's wooden cities would do what high-explosive bombs from altitude could not. The crews had a phrase for what they thought of the plan. On the interphones of the aircraft lining up on the Mariana runways that first night, the dark sentiment was the same. LeMay was going to get them all killed. He wasn't. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29 Superfortresses lifted off from airfields on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. The target was Tokyo, the most populous city on Earth, a metropolis of closely packed wood and paper buildings, housing more than 1 million people within the target zone alone. Pathfinder aircraft arrived first, dropping napalm in patterns that marked the target in a blazing cross visible for miles. Then the main force followed, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs, 500,000 cylinders of napalm and white phosphorus, onto the designated 3x4-mile rectangle of the city. The wind was blowing at 45 to 67 miles per hour off the southwest. What followed was beyond what even LeMay had calculated. The fires didn't burn. They exploded. The individual blazes merged into a single firestorm that generated its own weather. Superheated air rising so fast that the B-29s flying through it bucked and pitched like boats in a gale, and the smell of burning reached the crews through the sealed aircraft skins. One airman, far back in the formation, reported he could almost read by the light coming up through the nose of his aircraft. The river Sumida, running through the target district, glowed red. By the time the fires burned out, approximately 15.8 square miles of Tokyo had been destroyed. More than 267,000 buildings were gone. Somewhere between 80,000 and 100, 0 people were killed in a single night, more than would die immediately at Hiroshima. 1 million were left without shelter. It was, and remains, the single most destructive air attack in the history of human warfare. Japan's civil defense system was overwhelmed before it could respond. Fire brigades that rushed toward the burning districts were turned back by walls of flame. Survivors who tried to reach the rivers found the water itself had turned scalding from the heat. The Japanese later called that night the Night of the Black Snow. The charred debris that drifted for miles across the city in the hours after the Raid. LeMay had lost 14 aircraft. That was, by the metrics of strategic bombing, an almost impossibly low price. He calculated, correctly, that the mission had proved the concept. The next night he sent his B-29s against Nagoya, then Osaka, then Kobe, then Nagoya again. 5 cities in 5 days. In a single week in March 1945, the X-1 Bomber Command dropped more incendiary tonnage on Japan than had been dropped in the entire previous campaign. After the March raids, Japanese air opposition declined steadily. The country simply had too few fighters capable of reliably intercepting the Superfortress, and what it had was being worn down. B-29s began ranging across Japan's home islands almost at will, burning city after city. Workers abandoned factories. The Japanese Strategic Survey conducted after the war concluded that by July 1945, Japan's industrial workforce attendance had fluctuated as much as 50%, with morale crushed by the continuous raids. 1/4 of all lesser factories, the small workshops that fed Japan's larger industrial plants, had been destroyed. Japan was being hollowed out from the air, and it had no answer for the machine doing it. On August 6, 1945, a specially modified B-29 named the Enola Gay lifted off from Northfield on Tinian. Its bomb bay carried a single weapon, a uranium bomb the crews had nicknamed Little Boy. Over Hiroshima, the bomb bay doors opened. 3 days later, a second modified Superfortress, Boxcar, dropped a plutonium device on Nagasaki. Both aircraft were B-29s, drawn from the 509th Composite Group, modified under a classified program known as Silverplate to carry the only weapons the Manhattan Project had produced. The B-29 and the Manhattan Project, the two costly programs of the American war effort, had been designed, from the beginning, to work together. One provided the weapon. The other was the only aircraft in existence capable of delivering it. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people for the first time by radio. The war would end. Japan would surrender. The instrument of that surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. And on that same morning, 462 B-29 Superfortresses flew in formation over the fleet, a final demonstration of the force that had ended the war. $3 billion. More than 3,900 aircraft built across 4 factories, 600 combat crewmen lost over Japan, tens of thousands of bombs dropped, and cities reduced to ash from Yokohama to Nagasaki. Curtis LeMay had said, with the bluntness that marked everything he did, that if the United States lost the war, he would be tried as a war criminal for what the B-29 campaign had done. He was not wrong about the weight of what had occurred. The firebombing of Japan's cities killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. That cost sits inside the history of the Superfortress, inseparable from the account of what it achieved. To tell the story of the B-29, honestly, is to carry both things at once. The astonishing capability and the terrible use to which it was put. The Japanese who survived called it Bisan. Mr. B, they said it with fear, and with something close to awe. The acknowledgement that the thing coming for them operated by rules they could not match, and at a scale they could not answer. It was a machine that had cost the United States more than any single project in the war's history, built under conditions that nearly broke the program before it started, flown by crews who were sometimes not sure they would come home, and directed finally by a general willing to make the most consequential and morally freighted decisions of the air war. The B-29 Superfortress ended the Pacific War. The full weight of what that means, what it cost, on every side is the only honest way to remember it.